The sun was just beginning to set over the sprawling African savanna, casting a golden glow across the safari lodge nestled in the heart of the wilderness. The air was warm, and the sounds of distant wildlife echoed through the trees. Inside the lodge, a young couple, Sarah and Mark, were enjoying their first evening after a long journey to this remote paradise. Their baby, Emily, was fast asleep in the small tent they had set up just outside the main lodge area, surrounded by the beauty and quiet of nature. The couple had been eagerly anticipating this adventure for months, thrilled to explore the vast landscapes, encounter exotic wildlife, and experience the heart of Africa. But nothing could have prepared them for the terrifying moment that would change their lives forever. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Sarah went to check on Emily, the baby's soft breathing the only sound inside the tent. But when she unzipped the flap to peek inside, a wave of panic gripped her chest. Emily was gone. The small cot where she had been sleeping was empty, the blanket twisted and discarded on the ground. Sarah's heart raced. She called out, hoping for a response, but the only reply was the distant hum of the jungle. Mark, who had been outside the tent, heard his wife's frantic cries and rushed to her side. "Sarah, what's wrong?" With trembling hands, Sarah explained that Emily was missing. Mark's face went pale. He immediately sprang into action, checking the tent once more to make sure he hadn't missed anything. But it was clear there was no sign of their baby. The peaceful surroundings they had admired earlier now felt eerily silent and threatening. They rushed to the lodge's main building, calling for help. The safari guides, who had been preparing for an evening tour, turned to see the couple in distress. One of them, a seasoned guide named Quaim, saw the panic in their eyes and quickly understood the gravity of the situation. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded and motioned for the others to follow him. Quaim knew these jungles better than anyone. His years of experience had taught him the dangers that lurked, from wild animals to the harsh, unpredictable environment. But this was different. This wasn't about avoiding predators. It was about saving a life. The guides quickly organized into a search party. They grabbed their gear and prepared to venture into the wilderness, knowing that every moment counted. The couple's cries of panic echoed behind them as they moved toward the dense brush where the baby had likely wandered off. Quaim instructed the guides to start by following the baby's trail, though he knew the situation was precarious. Emily was so small and helpless in this vast, untamed wilderness. There was no telling what dangers lay ahead. The group's every step was carefully measured as they navigated through the thick foliage, hoping for a sign, any sign that would lead them to the missing child. The search was slow, methodical, and tense. Every rustle in the trees, every movement in the undergrowth made their hearts skip a beat. It was nearly impossible to predict where the baby might have gone, and the sinking feeling of fear and uncertainty weighed heavily on their shoulders. Would they find her in time? The search party continued to push deeper into the jungle, the dense foliage growing thicker with each step. Quaim led the group, his keen eyes scanning the ground for any signs that could guide them toward Emily. The jungle, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now felt like a maze, each tree and bush hiding potential dangers. The air was thick with humidity, and every breath felt heavy, making it harder to focus. Yet there was no time to waste. The child was out there somewhere, alone and vulnerable. The guides worked in pairs, with each group keeping close to one another. They moved carefully, their boots making soft thuds on the damp ground, trying not to disturb the wildlife that might be hiding in the shadows. The jungle was alive with sound, but none of it felt reassuring. There were birds calling in the distance, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional growl of unseen animals, but nothing that signaled they were getting closer to their goal. Sarah and Mark followed just behind the guides, anxiety growing with each passing minute. Mark clenched his fists, trying to fight the panic building inside him. He couldn't shake the image of his little girl, alone in the wild, surrounded by dangers they couldn't even imagine. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, kept calling Emily's name, her voice cracking with fear. It was the only thing she could do. The quiet, desperate calls echoed through the jungle, but there was still no response. Quaim signaled for the group to stop. He crouched down to examine something on the ground. The rest of the guides gathered around him, and he pointed to the soft, barely noticeable footprints in the dirt. "This way," he said, his voice low and focused. He stood up and motioned for everyone to follow, and they did, moving more cautiously now, knowing they had found something. These were small footprints, barely visible, but they were unmistakable. They were definitely from a child. As they followed the trail, the path became clearer. The footprints were soft, as if Emily had been walking, or perhaps crawling, through the underbrush. The guides picked up their pace, each step more purposeful than the last. The forest was becoming denser, and the trees were growing taller, their branches interwoven, blocking out much of the sunlight. It felt like they were entering a different world, a world where the rules of the outside did not apply. The temperature was cooler here, but it only added to the tension. Quaim moved with purpose, carefully checking each direction as they advanced. The trail led them further into the jungle, and Sarah and Mark tried to keep up, their hearts pounding in their chests. Every time they thought they heard a sound, they would freeze, hoping it was Emily. But it wasn't. The silence between the calls became unbearable. The guide stopped again, this time much more abruptly. Quaim crouched low to the ground, his eyes scanning the area intently. There was something in the air, something that didn't sit right. He held up his hand to signal everyone to remain still. The wind had shifted, and with it, a distant sound reached their ears, a faint buzzing, like a swarm of bees. Everyone looked around, and the realization hit them all at once. They were getting close. They had to be careful now. The jungle was full of dangers, and the baby's trail was leading them to one of the worst. The buzz grew louder with every step, a steady hum that sent a chill down the backs of the search party. Quaim motioned for everyone to be quiet, his instincts telling him that they were on the brink of something dangerous. The jungle had been full of noise, but this constant, growing buzz was unmistakable. It was the sound of a bee swarm, and that meant one thing. They had to be incredibly careful. Quaim signaled for the group to slow down and spread out a little, keeping their movements deliberate and calm. The last thing they needed was to startle the bees, or worse, draw their attention. He motioned for Mark and Sarah to stay close, his experienced eyes constantly scanning the trees and the ground. They moved through the thick brush, the oppressive humidity making every movement feel sluggish and slow. With each step, the sound of the buzzing seemed to vibrate through the air, and the guides were now certain that they were nearing the source. Sarah clutched Mark's arm, her mind racing. She had heard about bees and their stings, but she never imagined something like this would be a real threat to her baby. Every nerve in her body screamed to hurry, but Quaim's firm, calm presence reminded her that they couldn't afford to make rash decisions now. They were on the right path, but every second was vital. As they crept forward, the dense vegetation opened up slightly, and the first signs of danger became apparent. Quaim raised his hand to halt the group. In the distance, a large tree stood, its trunk thick and gnarled, with a mass of bees swirling around it. The hive. And below it, barely visible through the thick brush, was the small, limp figure of Emily. The baby lay still on the ground, surrounded by a cloud of angry bees that had clearly settled around her. It was impossible to tell how long she had been there, but Sarah's heart stopped when she saw the small body, covered in bee stings, pale and unmoving. The sight of her daughter, vulnerable and so close to danger, made Sarah's breath catch in her chest. Quaim stepped forward cautiously, his mind already working. He knew how to handle these kinds of situations. He was quick, yet deliberate as he made his way toward the hive. His focus was on the bees, but his eyes never left the baby. Mark stood frozen, unable to move, his heart pounding in his chest. His baby girl was in harm's way, and all he wanted to do was run and scoop her up in his arms. But Quaim held up his hand, signaling for Mark to wait. He had a plan, and it was the only way to safely get Emily away from the hive. The guides began to work quickly, moving into position with the precision of professionals. One guide, the most experienced with dealing with bees, carefully made his way around the edge of the hive, moving slowly and calmly. He knew the bees would be aggressive, but they would settle if they didn't feel threatened. Quaim moved swiftly now, using the resources at his disposal. He reached into his bag and pulled out a cloth soaked in a strong-smelling herbal mixture known to calm the bees. He held it close to his face to shield himself from the angry swarm and carefully approached Emily. It took a few tense moments, but with great care, he lifted the baby from the ground, holding her gently but firmly. Mark and Sarah could barely breathe as they watched the guide's every move. The bees buzzed fiercely around them, but the calming herbs worked their magic. Slowly, the guide stepped back, guiding Quaim away from the hive and toward a safe spot. Sarah's heart was in her throat as she finally allowed herself to move forward, closing the distance between her and Emily. She reached out for her daughter, her hands shaking as she gently touched the baby's tiny body. Emily was barely conscious, her face swollen from the stings, but she was alive. That was all that mattered now. Mark wrapped his arms around Sarah, both of them feeling an overwhelming wave of relief, though they knew the danger wasn't over yet. Emily needed medical attention, and they had to move quickly. Quaim signaled for the group to leave the area, and they began the long trek back toward the safety of the lodge. The jungle seemed less menacing now, but the terror of what they had just witnessed would stay with them for a long time. The journey back to the lodge was a blur of tense steps and racing hearts. Sarah held Emily close, the baby's small body limp in her arms, her soft breathing the only sign that she was still alive. Every step felt like an eternity, and Sarah couldn't stop herself from glancing down at Emily, her heart clenching with worry. The swelling from the bee stings was severe, and the little girl's face was unrecognizable, her delicate skin now puffed up and discolored. It was terrifying to see her like this, but at least she was breathing. Quaim led the group with steady confidence, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. He knew they couldn't afford to move too quickly, but they couldn't afford to move too slowly either. The jungle, despite its beauty, was unforgiving, and they still had to be cautious of every danger lurking in the shadows. His experience with the land, the wildlife, and even medical emergencies gave him the calmness that the others lacked. He knew exactly what needed to be done, but that didn't ease the weight on his shoulders. Time was of the essence. As they walked, one of the guides began searching for any medicinal plants that could help ease Emily's pain, something that could reduce the swelling and calm the sting of the bees. Quaim had already checked her pulse and breathing earlier, confirming that she was alive. But she needed more than just a safe passage back to the lodge. She needed immediate care. Mark walked next to Quaim, his face pale, his hands trembling as they gripped Emily's tiny blanket. He could feel the weight of every second that passed. He wasn't sure how much longer his daughter would be able to hold on. Each of Emily's shallow breaths seemed like a miracle, but the swelling from the stings was still spreading, and he knew that there was more danger ahead. The bees weren't the only threat here. Parasites, dehydration, and the wild elements of the jungle all posed dangers to an already fragile child. How much longer? Mark finally managed to ask, his voice strained with worry. Quaim didn't look back as he answered. Not far. Stay strong. We're close. His voice was firm, but the urgency behind his words wasn't lost on anyone. They had been walking for what felt like hours, and every rustle in the trees, every distant animal call sent their hearts into overdrive. But Quaim's confidence helped steady them, giving them hope that they would make it back in time. Sarah's eyes were locked on Emily, unable to look anywhere else. Her baby girl, who had been so full of life just that morning, now seemed fragile, a small bundle of discomfort and pain. The bee stings had made her face unrecognizable, her delicate features swollen and red. But still, Emily was holding on. her tiny body fighting for survival in a way Sarah couldn't fully understand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the thick jungle began to thin. The air felt cooler, the trees less dense, and the distant sounds of the lodge began to reach their ears. With every step, Sarah's heart beat a little faster, and a part of her believed they were going to make it. They were going to be okay. They reached the lodge just as the last rays of sunlight began to fade. A few of the staff members, alerted to their return, rushed out to meet them. One of them, a woman who had medical training, quickly assessed Emily's condition and took the baby from Sarah's arms with a gentle but efficient touch. "Get her inside," the woman instructed calmly. "We need to treat those stings immediately." Quaim stepped aside, allowing the lodge staff to take over, but he didn't leave. He had seen this kind of thing before, and he knew that the baby would need help. But it wasn't over yet. The next few hours would determine whether the child would fully recover. Inside the lodge, the staff worked quickly, applying cold compresses to Emily's swollen face and using natural remedies to calm the bee stings. They administered fluids to help hydrate the baby, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah and Mark allowed themselves to breathe. The danger wasn't over, but they had made it. They had survived the worst of it. The guides had done their part, and now it was in the hands of the lodge staff to ensure Emily's recovery. As the night settled in, Sarah sat by her daughter's side, her fingers gently stroking the baby's tiny hand. They had made it through the worst of the jungle, but the battle for Emily's health was just beginning. The night felt long as Emily lay in the small bed, her body covered in cold compresses to reduce the swelling. The lodge was quiet, save for the occasional sounds of the jungle outside. The buzzing of insects and the calls of distant animals were muffled now, replaced by the gentle hum of the lodge's lights and the steady sound of Emily's breathing. Sarah sat beside her daughter, her hand resting lightly on the baby's tiny chest, watching the rise and fall of her little body. Every breath seemed like a miracle, but the fear still lingered in Sarah's heart. The worst was over, but the recovery process would be slow, and no one knew how much damage the bee stings had caused. Mark sat across from Sarah, his eyes fixed on his daughter, his face a mask of exhaustion and worry. They hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived at the lodge, both of them too drained to find the right words. The relief they had felt when they saw Emily safely brought inside had quickly been replaced by concern. It wasn't enough just to get her away from the bees. Now, they had to focus on her recovery. The swelling had subsided a little, but Emily's skin was still marked, and the redness was noticeable in places. Quaim had stayed by their side, offering support and guidance as the staff worked tirelessly to stabilize Emily. He was no longer the calm and collected leader of the search party. Now he was a quiet observer, ready to step in if needed. The guides had done their part, but this was where the professionals took over. As the minutes turned to hours, Quaim reassured Mark and Sarah that Emily would be okay. "The swelling is serious, but it's a good sign she's still breathing. Keep her calm, and we'll make sure she's well again." As the night wore on, the lodge staff worked quietly to monitor Emily's condition, taking turns to check on her and administer the necessary treatments. They applied soothing ointments to the stings and checked her vitals every so often, ensuring the swelling didn't get worse and that she was still stable. There was still the lingering danger of an allergic reaction, but for now, the baby was out of immediate danger. Sarah's hand never left Emily's side, her fingers brushing gently against her baby's skin, a quiet reassurance that she was still there. Quaim returned a few times to check on the baby's condition. Each time, his presence offered a sense of comfort. Sarah, though grateful for the help, still felt a deep sense of unease. Her mind replayed the terrifying moment she had found her daughter surrounded by bees, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to worry about. The night felt endless, each minute stretching on as she anxiously watched her daughter, praying that Emily would pull through. Mark, exhausted but unwilling to leave his family's side, sat by the window, staring out into the dark jungle. The peaceful surroundings now felt haunting. The adventure they had dreamed of had taken a sudden, terrifying turn, and nothing felt certain anymore. But despite everything, he clung to the hope that Emily would recover. The guides had done everything they could, and the lodge staff was doing their best. Now it was up to Emily's resilience to see her through. Outside, the night seemed calm, but Sarah knew the jungle held its secrets. For now, the most important thing was inside the lodge, her daughter, safe but fragile, resting and healing. They had been through the worst, but the road to recovery would be long. Sarah knew this was far from over, but the worst was behind them. They just had to hold on a little longer, and soon Emily would be back in their arms, whole and healthy once again. The journey was far from over, but with each passing moment, the family was one step closer to healing. The following morning arrived with a quiet, tentative peace. The early light filtered through the windows of the lodge, casting soft rays across the room where Emily lay resting. Sarah had hardly slept the entire night, her eyes barely leaving her daughter's side, but Emily's steady breathing gave her a sense of hope. The swelling had gone down somewhat, and though she still looked fragile, the color had returned to her skin, making Sarah breathe a little easier. Mark was finally asleep in a chair nearby, his face tired and worn, but there was a calm in his posture now, something that had been missing the day before. Quaim had stayed with them as long as he could, ensuring the staff was doing everything possible to help Emily recover. But now, as the sun rose higher in the sky, he had to attend to other matters, though he promised to check in throughout the day. He was the calm force they needed during the crisis, and Sarah was grateful for his expertise and reassurance. She knew it was far from over, but Emily's steady breathing and the soothing sounds of the jungle outside gave her some sense of peace. The lodge staff moved quietly, tending to their daily duties but checking on Emily from time to time. They offered Sarah and Mark fresh water and food. Knowing they hadn't had a proper meal in hours, Sarah had tried to eat a little, but her mind was still consumed with worry. Her thoughts kept going back to the events of the previous day, the terrifying discovery of Emily surrounded by the angry bees, the hours of searching, and the relief when they finally reached safety. It had been a nightmare, but somehow they had made it through. Emily began to stir, her tiny hands twitching slightly as her eyelids fluttered. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she leaned forward, her fingers brushing her daughter's forehead. Emily's eyes opened slowly, and for a moment, she just blinked, as if unsure of where she was. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, but when Emily's gaze focused on her, a small, tired smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to melt Sarah's heart. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Sweetheart, are you awake?" The baby's small hand reached out, finding her mother's finger, gripping it weakly. It was a simple gesture, but to Sarah, it meant everything. She could feel the weight of the relief in her chest, the heavy burden of fear slowly starting to lift. Mark stirred, waking up at the sound of his wife's voice. He blinked in confusion for a moment before realizing what was happening. His tired eyes softened, and he rushed over to Emily's side, kneeling beside her. "Is she?" Mark started, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "She's awake," Sarah replied, her voice full of emotion. "She's still weak, but she's here." Mark reached out and gently touched Emily's tiny hand, and for a moment, both parents just sat there, looking at their daughter, a mix of exhaustion, relief, and gratitude filling their hearts. The nightmare of the previous day had been terrifying, but now, seeing Emily's eyes open and her hand reaching for them, it felt like a miracle. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but there was a glimmer of hope in her movements. The lodge staff continued to monitor her condition, checking her vitals and making sure she had plenty of fluids. Sarah and Mark stayed by her side, talking softly to her, offering encouragement, and making sure she was as comfortable as possible. Emily was still fragile, and her recovery would take time, but seeing her respond, even in small ways, made it clear that she was fighting. The day passed slowly, with moments of quiet calm and flashes of worry. But Sarah knew that the hardest part was behind them. They had faced the terrifying unknown together, and now they could finally begin to focus on Emily's healing. It wouldn't be easy, but they would get through it. The ordeal had brought them closer, reminding them of the importance of family and the strength they could draw from each other. And as Emily slept peacefully in her mother's arms, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger than before. As the days passed, Emily's recovery slowly but steadily continued. The swelling in her face had mostly gone down, and the redness from the bee stings had faded to a dull pink. Her little body, though still frail, seemed stronger with each passing hour. Sarah and Mark remained by her side, watching over her like hawks, never letting their guard down. Every slight movement, every soft sound she made was met with a wave of concern, but also a sense of relief. The lodge staff continued to care for her, ensuring she had plenty of fluids and food to help her regain strength. Emily, however, wasn't yet interested in eating much, her appetite still small and weak. Sarah could only smile with exhaustion when Emily took a few sips of water or nibbled on the smallest piece of fruit. The fact that she was drinking at all was a victory, and Sarah was grateful for these little steps forward. Mark, though relieved to see his daughter improving, couldn't shake the anxiety that still lingered in the back of his mind. The day Emily had gone missing felt like it had happened just yesterday. He had trouble sleeping at night, his mind replaying the terrifying moments when he and Sarah had frantically searched for their daughter in the jungle. The fear of losing her had been all-consuming. Yet every time he looked at Emily, sitting propped up in bed with a small smile on her face, he was reminded that their family had made it through. Emily was resilient, and she had proved just how strong she was. It was something Mark had always known about her, even though she was so young. And now, with each tiny victory, each giggle, each tiny movement, he saw more of that strength emerging. In the evenings, as the sun began to set, Sarah and Mark would sit together by the window, watching the darkening jungle. The sounds of the forest seemed less threatening now, more like a peaceful backdrop to their recovery. There was a quiet beauty in the way the evening settled in, and Sarah would often let out a sigh, content in the moment. They still had a long road ahead, but they had already come so far. Emily was here, and she was alive. That was what mattered. Quaim had returned to the lodge to check on them, as he promised, but it was clear from his demeanor that the guides and staff were all proud of how far Emily had come. They had all been part of the rescue, each playing their role in ensuring that the family made it through the ordeal. For Quaim, it had been just another day in the jungle, another life saved. But for Sarah and Mark, it had been something much bigger. It had been a miracle. Quaim sat with them one afternoon as Emily slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, the soft sounds of her breathing filling the room. The guide smiled at the family and asked, "How is she doing now?" "Better," Sarah said, her voice calm but still filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "She's not fully herself yet, but she's getting there. Slowly but surely." Quaim nodded, pleased with the progress. "It's always like this, you know," he said. "The jungle can be dangerous, but sometimes it shows you just how strong a person can be. You've both been strong, and so has your little girl." Mark looked at Emily, his heart swelling with emotion. "She's our little fighter," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "She's been through so much already, and we've all learned to appreciate every single moment we have with her." Quaim stood up to leave, offering a parting smile. "Keep being strong. You're not alone here. If you need anything, just let us know." As the door closed behind him, Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling a deep sense of peace. The worst was behind them, and while the road to complete recovery might still take time, there was no doubt in her mind that Emily would be just fine. Together, they would face whatever came next, knowing they had the strength to make it through, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. The days that followed were a mixture of relief, recovery, and reflection. Emily was still a bit fragile, but with each new day, it was clear that the worst was behind them. Her appetite returned slowly, and her tiny hands, which had once been limp and weak, began to grasp things more firmly again. Sarah and Mark watched these small but significant improvements with growing joy, feeling like a weight was being lifted from their shoulders with every milestone. They knew there was still a long road to go, but their hearts felt lighter each time they saw their daughter smile. Sarah found herself reflecting on how much their lives had changed in such a short time. Just days ago, their family had been thrust into a terrifying situation, one that no one could have predicted. The jungle had shown them its dangers, but it had also shown them the power of human resilience and the kindness of strangers. The guides had risked their lives to bring Emily back, and the staff at the lodge had given them a safe place to heal. All of it, the good and the bad, had made them closer as a family, and Sarah couldn't help but feel incredibly grateful for that. Mark, too, found his thoughts drifting back to the moment when Emily had been found in the jungle, surrounded by those aggressive bees. He still couldn't fully understand how it had happened or why they had been so lucky to get her back. It felt like a twist of fate, something beyond their control. But in the days since, he had been reminded over and over again just how precious life was. His daughter had been in danger, but now she was here with them, safe and sound. That alone was worth more than anything else. The evening sun bathed the lodge in a warm, golden light as Sarah and Mark sat outside, watching the world around them slowly settle into the stillness of night. The sky above stretched wide and endless, full of stars, reminding them how vast and unpredictable life could be. The forest around the lodge seemed quieter now, almost peaceful in comparison to the chaos that had surrounded them just days before. The sounds of distant wildlife were gentle, like a lullaby to the world, and the quiet murmurs of the lodge staff tended to their evening tasks. Emily was inside, tucked into bed, resting peacefully for the first time in what felt like forever. The past few days had been emotionally draining, but seeing her finally sleep without pain or discomfort was a relief. Mark and Sarah had spent hours by her side, talking to her, comforting her, and making sure she felt safe. They hadn't left her alone for a moment. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they knew that their love for each other and for Emily had only grown stronger through the ordeal. The challenges they had faced had taught them lessons they would carry with them forever. They were no longer just tourists visiting a distant land. They had been transformed into survivors, a family bound together by love and the will to protect each other. Quaim stopped by once more to check on Emily's condition. He smiled as he saw her resting, the baby's small chest rising and falling gently with each breath. He had seen many things in the jungle, some of them heartbreaking, but this was a story he would never forget. He offered one last piece of advice before he left, telling Sarah and Mark, "Cherish these moments. Life is precious, and the people you hold dear are what make it worthwhile." That evening, as the stars sparkled above and the forest quieted down, Sarah and Mark sat together, their hearts full of gratitude. They had been through something unimaginable, but they had come out the other side stronger, closer, and with a deeper appreciation for the life they shared. Emily, still sleeping peacefully in her bed, was the living proof of that strength. The journey had been tough, but their family was whole, and for now, that was all that mattered. As they looked out at the beautiful, peaceful night, they felt a renewed sense of hope for the future, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family.